Hello and welcome back to the Undivide Project Podcast Changemakers Edition. I am your host, Monica Sanders, and this season, season 2, we are highlighting women who are doing the work, making change in the environmental and climate justice space. And I'm so excited to be joined by Gianna White. Gianna, great to see you here.
Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Gianna White. I am a climate justice advocate, a sustainability scientist, I like to call myself. And a lot of the work that I try to do is to help build more sustainable cities and make sure that no one is left behind in the process.
Which is incredible work because a lot of times when we have these conversations, the faces at the table don't look like our faces.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to start with what inspired you to get into this space and to do this kind of activism and work?
So I guess my interest in climate started in high school. I was about 15 or 16, and I chose to research climate change for a project just randomly. And the more I learned about it, the more I was just kind of distraught, but also just a little annoyed because there were a lot of these massive effects happening to communities like mine, and they didn't need to be. And in all of the research that I did, there were large ripple effects in areas that I didn't even think of. Like, I was very aware of the air pollution in the city I was living in at the time, but
Right.
I learned about things like climate change exacerbates things like allergies, and I just thought that was so absurd. There have to be more people working on this because there's a senselessness to that amount of suffering. So I was really set on working in the climate sphere. Originally, when I first entered college, I was like a computer engineer because I wanted something flexible, and I also wanted to make money at the time, I will say.
Which is a real concern.
It was a real concern, but the more I did that work, it was ultimately pretty unfulfilling, even at an undergrad level. So I pivoted and I was like, okay, if I'm going to really and honestly do this work, I'm gonna go in 100%. I swapped my major to sustainable urban environments while I was at NYU. And ever since then, that's all I've been studying. And even in my personal time, my advocacy work is in the climate space. Pretty much I feel like everything I do is in some way, shape, or form geared towards sustainability now.
And there's a couple of things I want to unpack. One thing, when you said, you got interested in this in high school and you were shocked that more people weren't working on it. And I always like to place people in the climate change advocacy timeline, just so that the audience can understand how long different people have been coming to work on this.
Mm-hmm.
And so for you, high school was around what year and point in time?
So I guess between 2014 and 2018. So I was probably about 16 at the time, so 2016.
So 1996 was when Al Gore put out the documentary Heat.
Yes.
Then he followed it up 6 years later with An Inconvenient Truth, which is when we first started to get some legal evidence of what the oil and gas industry were doing in the climate space. Then in 2008, we have our Kyoto Protocols, which started the COP, which is a predecessor to the COP meetings. And so now we're heading into COP 29,
Yeah.
which is a full adult. And we're crossing into, because I would say it's fair to say that Al Gore is a baby boomer. And so we've gone through a young baby boomer, through Gen X, through millennials, and now I would say you're a millennial Gen Z cusper that's entering into the space with the same concerns, because An Inconvenient Truth and Heat surface things like allergies. This is the root cause for asthma in some communities. This is the root cause for why some people are more susceptible to different kinds of illnesses. This is a reason why we have cancer clusters in some space. And so not to call out an age or generational difference, but just so the audience can grasp each time where we are in this timeline of advocating for the same issues, which probably had a reason why you were so outraged, because you were sort of like, this isn't a new topic. Why haven't we advanced in the past when you entered it in almost 10 years, 20 years? Question for you, because as we said, this isn't a decision table that's diverse when we're talking about sustainable cities. How do you do outreach to communities to help them become aware that sustainability is something they can do, and to get them to buy into going through some of the processes or to learning more about this work and what that can mean for them?
I think, at least in what I've seen, especially in like the New York Northeast region, people are already doing the work in their own sort of way. It's just, there are a lot of times, especially in like Western science, that don't recognize what the work that people are doing now as like valid sustainability work, essentially. And there are also a lot of times when people are doing the work, but they can't exactly, I guess, promote it or say that they're doing the work. I wrapped up a project a few years ago on like community gardens in New York City. We're trying to map
Yes.
like all of the urban ag space, which was a monumental project. But one of the things we weren't able to do is genuinely go and map all of the community gardens, because there are a lot of guerrilla gardens where people take back like these privately owned, like large plots of land that are like due for some business venture, like building in 10, 20 years, and isn't being used right now, but is land that the community can use to grow food in the middle of a food desert. And it's not work that, like, it's work that if it was, I guess, out there, the city would probably like tear that community garden
Oh,
down.
wow.
So I think intrinsically, a lot of what a lot of communities of color know how to interact with the land and know how to promote like sustainable ideologies, like in recycling, in reusing and reducing. It's just, I guess, they don't call it that, is really what it is. They sort of just do it. And it's getting that vocabulary to them, which helps with things like when they need to write a grant for like a community project to get funding for it. That's really what we add. Going out and having these conversations so people can have the language, and also doing, to a certain extent, climate education, so showing people different pathways and avenues and things to look out for. A lot of what we're doing, March for Science, in the last few years, we've been focusing a bit more on getting people prepared for like things like climate disasters, natural disasters, what to do during extreme heat, and giving people tools and resources to help themselves in that avenue. And people are open to it because that's how we protect our communities. And we know that, at a government level, at a federal level, like even at a state level, this isn't work that's prioritized at the moment. So our communities have to do it for each other. And people are pretty open, especially when it's like groups like ours that are scientists from the community who are part of their community. We're just saying, hey, me as a community member, this here's a box of tools that I want to give to you so that you can help yourself, and keep our community safe and healthy. Because, the people who are supposed to be doing this kind of work, the authority figures, they're not doing a great job. And it's getting better, I'll say. A lot of the tables that I've been going to now, and a lot of the talks that I've seen, people are trying to prioritize like diversity of thought, diversity of inclusion of ideas. But it's an uphill battle. Um, so it'll take a while till we can get to the point where equity and justice are prioritized at the level that like I would want personally. But in the meantime, people are trying to make space, and those little gaps, at least the ones that I can find, I always make sure to advocate for my community. And little changes progress is one of those things that happens very fast. You have a lot of progress at once, but change is constant, even if it's very small. And I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of little changes. And hopefully, eventually, in the next few years, we get to that big push for progress, like genuine progress.
Yeah, it can happen in fits and spurts. When we're talking about the longer issue of climate change, I think what gives me hope is that as a country, we have the resources and the science to do it. It's just a question of the political will.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm heartened, I'm fortunate to have some of my elders with me that have lived through a few historical touch points. And one of them, who's in their late 90s, pointed out to me, says, we have a way of waiting until the last possible second and then rapidly turning things around. Like, we've been this way with armed conflict. We were this way with the civil and women's rights movement, like in every one of our great historical moments. Don't let it be lost on you that we waited until the very last second and then, and then did monumental change at breakneck speed and then leapt forward by 20 years rather than doing work incrementally over 20 years. There's something about the Americans that we like to wait until the last second and then leap forward. I don't know what that's about, but you're smiling like you have heard. This is not the first time you've heard that commentary.
Yeah, I feel like most of my like the elders that I talk to say pretty much the same thing. What I always go back to is a conversation with my grandmother. She was telling me about when she was younger. Schools were still like segregated, and I was very young, so and I think this was around '08. Like this is when Obama was like running for president. She sat me down and she was like, "Okay, the nature of progress is that you'll have whatever status quo. People will tell you that you can't do certain things." She said when she was younger, like a black man being promoted to like fire chief was like something that was thought of as unimaginable. And she was like, "Look, now there's this black man who's about to become the president. The danger of the status quo is that it limits the scope of the imagination."
Yeah.
And when I think about like, are we going to fix something that seems so big and so unchangeable? I kind of have to tell myself, you have some blinders on. This seems impossible, but that doesn't mean that it is impossible. You are informed by the society that you were raised in, pretty much, and that can limit what you think is possible. So that's what I try to tell myself to keep going.
Is to keep going. And it is a good treasure to have in your kit, is to have access to people who've lived through cataclysmic moments that are able to temper that with wisdom
Yeah.
gained through lived experience, right? I am curious, in some of your community work, you talked about giving people the language and the vocabulary and helping them to be able to resource themselves to do some of this work that always has been sustainability. And I'm wondering if there's a project that you could share with us, if a community got a grant or if they were able to keep some of the land that they were working on, any of these topics. I would be interested in hearing it and to have the audience hear it so that they could understand some ways of how this actually translates, maybe give them permission to take on a project as well.
Yeah. One of the groups that we worked with the most, or at least I, like, as within March for Science worked with the most, was a group in the Bronx called, oh my goodness, I absolutely know their name. And because I worked
Oh,
with them for so long.
that should happen. You'll remember the name at some random point.
But they were, they were a group that focused on growing food. They the South Bronx is a big food desert, and a lot of what they did was working with and bringing in like high schoolers to sort of help them like learn how to grow food, but also teach them about environmental justice, about climate justice, and also help them like figure out what them doing this work looks like after they graduate high school and beyond. So we partnered with them for a few different of their ventures and our own, and they have a couple of, I guess they're those community fridges that where you put food that you grow and then it's open to the community. Anyone can take it, and it's restocked pretty regularly. They were working on getting land, I think upstate, last I heard from them. But a lot of what we did as March for Science was partnering with them for with their high schoolers for like climate workshops. And a lot of these kids, they were brilliant. They were fantastic, and I have so much hope for everything that comes after. But even the ones who were like, I want to go into this field that is completely unrelated to like sustainability and climate, like, this is something that is very important to me, and I am going to continue to like do this kind of work, even if I go off and become like a makeup YouTuber, then if I go off and become like an entrepreneur. Sustainability is like so deeply ingrained as like a cultural and like value point now for a lot of Gen Z. It's inspiring to see, and it's I don't know, it gives me hope, and it's really good work that's being done at a community level.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great example. And working at the community level is so tremendously important because never to take anything away from the science, but when we get updates from the IPCC or we get updates from the US government, it's not actionable data. Go ahead.
They're called One Freedom for All.
One freedom for all. And we'll make
Yes.
sure we put that in the show notes, right? That's how human memory works. Sort of like, you knew it was going to come back. It just needed a few seconds.
Yeah, phenomenal group. I loved working with them.
That is wonderful. And what we're saying is, I wonder if you find that people are also, to the extent that they're informed and they know from the news, that these reports are giving us warnings, but just like, well, what do I do about that in my home, in my community? That people actually are looking for the answer to the question of what can I do?
It's hard. I think a lot of what I've seen is even like at like the climate level, like I'm sometimes like my own friends who I'm studying with, they're like, what are we gonna do? Or what do I do as an individual? And so for those, I guess, especially at the community level, people who don't have like these sustainability and climate degrees, I I guess I want people to exist between 2 points. You have to do something, even at an individual level. Something that I've seen, especially like with my own generation, a lot of Gen Z blame capitalism for climate change, rightfully so. But the caveat to that is that a lot of people are now saying capitalism is unstoppable, climate change is unstoppable. There's nothing that I can do at an individual level when you have like these billionaires who fly across the world on a day to day basis and have these large carbon footprints. I can't do anything. And that's not true. It's a form of climate doomerism. Like we're too late to do anything, and that's not true for any sort of social justice issue, much less climate change. We're still very much underneath, our climate threshold, and there's still a lot of work that can and should be done. I think people are right when they say you as an individual can only do so much to limit like your own quote unquote carbon footprint, which isn't even a phrase that I like. It was coined by BP to like make people feel like they should be doing more. And
Wow. To
it's,
shift the blame from the company
yeah,
to the individual.
yeah.
Interesting.
And it worked. It was so effective.
We are all fixated on that.
Um, so there's a point between like climate doomerism and, being just so frantic and afraid about climate change. And that is what most people can do. Like one of your most effective tools is like organizing or just voting at a local level for people who have policies that promote the values that you want to be enacted at the local level. Politicians, especially council members who promote things like sustainability, who are fighting for these things, because a lot of these really, what seem like really small changes, are the things that are going to tide us over in the end. And this is one of the things that really keeps me going, is this quote that is like, there's power in smallness. And one of the things that I study is like sustainable systems and systems processes as a whole. And little, what I study is small intervention points that can have large effects in the climate sustainability sphere.
Okay.
So, like at a quantitative level, you very much can have very big changes by doing very little things. It doesn't feel that way, especially like, I don't know if you look at the news, there's this new Supreme Court case that's supposed to roll back air pollution protections. And
Yes.
that's super demoralizing, but and especially at the federal level, it doesn't seem like the work is happening. But I promise you, it is.
That case is demoralizing, but there's opportunity in that.
Yes.
And when I'm not doing this, I'm a law professor. And so when I have to talk my students through this, I said, now remember, if the standard goes back to a reasonableness standard, are you going to tell me that you can't find a single black or brown community to serve as your client where an agency has taken some action that doesn't meet the reasonableness standard? We'll find a way. That is the ingenuity that comes from coming from these divested communities, is where resources are lacking or constantly being taken from you, that is always overcome by ingenuity. And
Yeah.
so I'm watching this. I would love an example of a small intervention that can have a big impact.
I think, especially for communities that are in that, you know, I guess sometimes they're called like highly industrialized communities. So I
Mm-hmm.
am originally from Elizabeth, New Jersey, and that's like one such zone. Then
Yes.
the city next to ours, Newark, New Jersey, is another. It's really fighting at that local level for pollution standards. If you are in an area that has high rates of air and water pollution, it's much easier to get the people to like, it's, I don't want to say bully politicians, but it is much easier to bully your local like city council members, your mayor,
Yes.
than it is to like get to Joe Biden and try to get him to pass some sort of bill that he realistically can't, because that's Congress's job.
Yeah. And this has been one of the most unproductive Congresses in U.S. history.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the pragmatists will say redirect your energy. Um, but
And
also, the EJ movement began locally.
yes. Yes, yes, yes.
And so
Um,
sometimes the best way is to go back to the beginning. It's nice to have an executive order, but then how these things, the amount of time it takes for something to work its way through the federal government and have meaning locally can be lengthy even in a functional legislative structure.
yeah.
This is the way I'm going to politely refer to whatever's going on. I'm in the DC area, whatever is going on across the river.
Yeah.
Um,
And even on the flip side, I guess, I don't know what to call them. I guess anti climate advocates, they follow the same model, and They are frighteningly effective. One project that I am in the middle of wrapping up right now is on anti renewable groups. These people form like nonprofits.
Hmm.
And if you have never heard of people who are anti wind energy or anti solar, it's a whole mess. It's I know so much about it, but I'll save you some time.
I was like, but why?
It's so strange. And up until 7 years ago, if all of the literature said that, renewable energy is a nonpartisan issue, people are aware that we need more energy. We need to diversify our energy systems to have a functioning country. In the last 7 years, that has completely flipped on its head. And, now we have decades of scientific research that are kind of useless to a certain extent. And I don't want to blame any one politician, but there's a big new wave of misinformation, not just in the climate sector, but as a whole. In 2020, the World Health Organization declared an infodemic, meaning that there's so much misinformation
Yes.
just out in the world that it's hard for people when going online to find like your first piece of evidence to be factually true. And in the wind and solar sector, what we're seeing is a lot of disinformation, which is purposefully spread misinformation. In the offshore wind sector, which is what I'm studying mainly, there's this concern and propagated point of misinformation that offshore wind kills whales, which it does not. But people are using that as like a tactic to fight and sue these newly planned wind projects. And they are winning. They're very effective at stopping large scale renewable projects from being built. And groups as little as 24 people are able to kill an entire renewable energy project, which is supposed to, generate new forms of clean energy for a given city or state. And it's really an environmental justice issue at its core, because anything that is done to prolong the lifespan of these big fossil fuel energy plants, which are never ever located in an affluent place. They are only ever in low income communities of color. And these clean energy projects, which are being built next, especially for offshore wind, which is built like off beachfront property, these
Right.
affluent communities who are overwhelmingly white are very effective at getting these projects killed, prolonging the lifespan of fossil fuels, and which are in low income communities and poisoning their air. In the project that I did a lot of this research for is being scheduled to be built off of Ocean City, New Jersey. Ocean City has relatively low rates of childhood asthma. Places like Newark, New Jersey, 1 in 4 children have asthma. We can't keep, I guess these anti climate groups are taking like environmental justice tactics and killing climate projects, and it's kind of disheartening.
So I was going to say, what's the demography of these anti-climate groups?
They are overwhelmingly white and affluent. Leah Stokes did a paper analyzing, I think, every single wind project in both the US and Canada, and that was the conclusion. They're called, what is the term? I think they coined the term energy privilege. So that's people
Hmm.
who get all of the benefits of energy without any of the drawbacks. So you're not getting, any air or water pollution, but you get the benefit of, having energy at your disposal.
Yeah, I am going to pull that up so that it can go in the show notes. I'm fortunate to know Dr. Stokes, but I didn't realize she had done this particular project. It is energy privilege versus sacrifice zones.
Yes.
Because, as you pointed out, the vestiges of redlining, current land use policies is that you get certain areas that might have historically been communities of color, some of them with beautiful histories. Because there's a community in South Delaware that is historically a maroon community where people self liberated from slavery and formed an independent black township. But suddenly this became the ideal place, even though it was neither scientifically nor economically the best place to site a number of chemical plants. This was the area of choice. And so we see this cycle repeating itself everywhere where we have an environmental justice issue, some sort of Superfund site or over industrialized place. But then I was talking to someone who's in the solar energy sector when we look at clean energy, and I'm wondering on your response to this, and this is just solar, that white communities have 5 times the access to solar energy as black communities do.
Yeah, part of that is also, I guess, due to where scale solar is being implemented. I think the goal is to try to put most of it in rural areas. And from what I've heard, and I'm not an expert on solar, most of what I do is in the wind area, but it's there's less incentive to go into I guess solar is viewed as something that is expensive, and there's less incentive to go into black and brown communities and implement solar even at like the rooftop level. And the solar projects that I've seen in those communities have been like implemented by the community themselves.
Yep.
So I guess it's more like if they aren't going to do it, we, the community, are going to do it for ourselves.
Yes, that's what I've seen take place with that and with other transitions. Sort of people will access tax rebates if they can get the information and transition themselves, which also is a historical marker, a tradition that continues.
Yeah.
Going back to this, the makeup of the organization, it should be a nonpartisan issue. And this trend, not just in talking about killing wind projects or renewable energy projects, to use the tactics of the environmental justice movement. We also see this happening with funding for small business owners of color, anything that seems to want to do restorative work to communities of color. There's this interesting series of legal tactics that turn the civil, labor, or environmental justice movements on their head and use it to get a separate outcome. Earlier in our conversation, you called climate change a social justice issue. Why did you say that?
Because it really is at a fundamental level. If you look at the impacts of climate change up until this point, the people who are most predominantly hurt or killed by what is happening now are from the global south. Within the US and a lot of Western nations, the people who are hurt in those countries are from some sort of ethnic minority or they are from a low income community. If you divide by like the issue, I think, I don't know, but I think when most people think of climate change, they think of like extreme heat. If you look at that sector by itself, first of all, extreme heat is so scary. It is the most deadly natural disaster out of all the ones that we face. It kills more than tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes combined.
Right. There's no early warning system for extreme heat.
Yeah, and what we see at that level, if you look, there's I don't think it's implemented at the federal level, but within New York, we have what we call the Heat Vulnerability Index. That is who is most likely to be hurt or die due to extreme heat. It is frustratingly, overwhelmingly black people, non Latino blacks, who are killed by extreme heat. If you look at it by income, it is overwhelmingly poor people. If you look at it by like shelter status, unhoused people are, I think, 400 times more likely to
My
die
God.
due to extreme heat. It is an astronomical number. And so when you look at who's being hurt by climate change, you start to see it overlaps with the people who are already most socially vulnerable. It is our disabled people, it is our low income communities of color, it is our elders. So it's whenever I guess a lot of these social issues start to overlap. Uh, and you see that also within the advocacy spaces. A lot of the people who are, doing the work for Black social spaces are also in the climate space because we understand that there's intersectionality in our struggles and in these identities.
Yes, thank you for that. Because as soon as you said extreme heat, my mind's eye repopulated the images of Bangladesh last summer, where we just seemed to be okay with watching an entire population of people struggle with triple digit heat without the infrastructure to cope with it, and not a single conversation about how to deliver aid or relief in the midst of conversations about how to do aid for other kinds of natural hazards, right?
Yeah.
Like we know how to do an appeal after an earthquake and say, let's get lots of resources to country X because of this. But we couldn't seem to muster the creativity to say, we need to do a heat response in Bangladesh because we're watching a shocking amount of people die right after we just watched a shocking amount of people die because of flooding there, because it's one of the most climate impacted countries on the globe. But we couldn't work out how to do an international response to extreme heat, right? And in the United States, it seems, as you pointed out, there's a heat vulnerability index in New York. I don't think it's national. I've not heard of this in Virginia. We have programs statewide in Virginia, which I think makes it stand out amongst southern states to at least have put funding and resources into that. But this could really just boil down to where you live. Your survivability will depend on where you live.
Yeah, and it's really disheartening because at the current moment, I think homelessness is like at I think it's all time high since the '08 recession, and it's there are a lot of compounding factors in this very moment that make the summers more scary. Earlier, I was talking about like these groups who are shutting down renewable projects. That's bad not just because we need to transition to clean energy. It's bad because we don't have enough energy for the demand that we have right now. And
Yeah.
when that happens, one of two things happens. You have peaker plants, which emit a lot of carbon, which is awful, but they will meet the electricity or energy demand. And the alternative is that there is no energy, you have blackouts. And when that happens, in the middle of the summer, people die.
Yeah.
It's a lot of these systems seem to be overlapping. And even things like a lot of people who are on these newer medications for things like pretty much anything. And this isn't something that a lot of doctors will mention. It's in one of those, those long packets that they give you with your prescriptions
Right.
for
But no
anything
one reads.
that no one reads. They are, if you take any form of medication, it's very likely that you are more susceptible to heat stroke. And it's not something that people are even aware of to like look out for in during these very intense heat spells that we are going to, unfortunately, as the climate crisis develops, see more and more of. And we don't really have, like you were saying, the infrastructure or a lot of just the general like cultural knowledge on how to deal with extreme heat at these periods for these very long times. So we're kind of just, I want to say, floundering, and we need to very rapidly, if we are going to save the greatest number of lives, figure out new ways to address these things.
Yeah, and it's the importance of systems thinking in this cannot be overemphasized because you pointed out we're floundering, and some of the solutions to energy crises, when we treat them like an emergency when they pop up, as though the conditions were not present all the time, but we're really going to be concerned about this, say, in July, rather than doing something about it in February, is that the solutions that we'll do, the short-term solutions, are actually making the climate change issue worse. Because when you
Yeah.
fire up more fossil fuel driven plants, and so we're on this hamster's wheel of exacerbating the problem that we're trying to solve from a policy perspective. Not you and other people who are working on other measures, but from a federal policy level or even an international policy level. Is that we're on this hamster's wheel of, oh, well, we'll just, not decommission that nuclear power plant we were thinking about
Yeah.
decommissioning, or we'll push this coal-fired one, way past its upper limits of how long it should have been operational to meet these summer heat demands, or when we have extreme cold. The same thing. It's like we're making this situation worse. So at some point we have to break out of this.
I will say though, I did say I want to walk back what I said about us not having, I guess, the cultural knowledge to deal with a lot of these things. Um, what is by far the most effective way to deal with extreme heat is the buddy system. It is checking on your neighbors. It is if you know someone who is elderly, disabled, or in any way, shape, or form like vulnerable to heat stroke. It's literally just checking on them twice a day, especially during heat waves. And the part I it's hard, these big, wicked problems, because I don't think that federal level has the capability to do a lot of what is can be done at the local level and done just like within your on your block or within your apartment complex. And going back to the quote that I mentioned earlier, there's power in smallness. Doing what you can locally and within your community, I cannot emphasize enough, is one of the best ways to combat a lot of the really awful effects of climate change.
I was going to ask you, particularly, I never want to be Professor Doom. I don't want to make you Professor Doom. Is what advice can we give other people who want to get into this space, that want to use their talent? If you're a teacher, helping people understand. If you're an activist in one space, how you can be an activist in this space. If you're a mom or a dad, whatever your role is, what advice would you give people to get into this push towards making a more sustainable world?
I think, excuse me, I would say you should start. I think the best way to start is to like look up like green groups in your city, either like a nonprofit or some just sort of club, and see what they're doing, see what they need. Um, I'd also encourage people to like look at your city council. They, you, they, if you live in your district, they have to listen to you, and you can attend their meetings. Usually, they're open to the public. Sometimes they're even on Zoom, so you can sit while you're if you work remotely or just listen on your phone, and really just start either in your like local government, your local nonprofits, or look at like your community cultural or like knit points. So that would be like schools, like getting onto the PTA if you have a kid there, or looking at, you know, what is the Board of Ed doing? Looking at your churches if you are religious, and even if you are not, there are a lot of events that churches host that are not, necessarily religious oriented. And really building community space, I would say, is what we need to start doing if we are going to get to a more sustainability oriented society. We need to start rebuilding our third spaces. And anytime you participate in these activities, what you're effectively doing is a form of counter growth, I'll say. That is, you are siphoning a lot of um, resources, or not siphoning, but you are redirecting resources and energy to the local level where you can have the most impact. And if you are someone who is prioritizing sustainability and equity, that is where you need to be. Because, as I mentioned earlier, people who are very much against a lot of these ideologies and people who are genuinely very upset about the idea of equity, that is what they are doing. They're building, they launch nonprofits oriented at perpetuating lies about offshore wind and whales. And they get money from, you know, their from fossil fuel plants, from like Congress people who are working to not pass work against climate change or climate action, and are passing like bills to perpetuate fossil fuels. They are doing this work. So you, at your local level, just within your community, you don't have to, you know, go to Washington or anything. Just the people that you know, your neighbors, talking to them. Talking to your neighbors does a lot. And it's not something that's really, um, I think we've shied away from by and large within American culture.
Yeah.
And getting back to that, local, building local power and being able to exist collaboratively within your own community is what is eventually going to, that's what a sustainable society looks like. We can't continue, this mass hyper consumptive society. We kind of have to get back to our roots. So just showing up. You don't even have to know. You don't have to know the terms. You don't have to know anything. I didn't when I first started. I just showed up to a bunch of meetings. I didn't even say anything. I had no idea what was going on for a long time. And eventually, you will get to a point where you start to learn like these terms, and you can start to have whatever level of impact for whatever amount of energy that you put in, or at the very least you start to like become more inspired by the people around you who are doing very good work.
Thank you for that. So everyone who's listening, just show up. And thank you, Gianna, for giving some of your day to the Undivide Project in our podcast.
Absolutely.
So very quickly, tell the audience where they can follow your work.
You can find me on IG at just.gianna. I also have a LinkedIn. I don't know how to verbalize my LinkedIn, but if you enter Gianna White, I'll probably pop up. And March for Science NYC can be found at March for Science NYC, marchforscience.nyc, if you are interested in any of like our programming or upcoming things.
Of course. So marchforscience.nyc.
Yes.
I also don't know how to articulate the LinkedIn profile is what I think you can call it. But yeah, if you type in Gianna White, I know that works because that's how I connected to you. At just.gianna on Instagram. And thank you to the audience for tuning in on our second season of the Undivide Project podcast. You can follow our work on all social media channels at Undivide Project. And be sure to tune in on our next episode where we will be unpacking the concept of crypto and the possibility that we might be able to do it in a sustainable way. So tune in. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, on our YouTube channel, or anywhere where you get your podcast. And we will talk to you next time. Thank you so much for joining us.